Good evening. We're our second class on ethical dilemmas in the parsha, and since last week we almost didn't get to the ethical dilemma in the parsha, so I'd like to do this backwards and start with the issue, and then we'll go back into the verses. So the question is like this: how much are we responsible for other people when those people are doing things counter to the plans that we have, or that we are, things we are trying to do in our lives, in our plans? What that means is, you've got ideas, you've got things you want to do, you've got things you'd like to get done, you've got things that you'd like to in the short term, you've got things in the long term, and then there are people who come into your lives, or people who are in your lives, who get in the way of those things, to put it mildly. And you have a choice. You can distance yourself from those people. You can reject those people and then continue to do whatever it is that you were supposed to do. Or you're responsible to other people, and for their sake, for others, you are to put off, to delay your goals, your plans, whatever it is that you would like to do, for the sake of others. That's the question. That's the ethical dilemma. And part of this is a question of, in what way are those people, are you responsible for those people? So, for example, parents who have a plan of maybe accomplishing a certain amount of or of doing something, and they have children, so clearly I think we all understand that by definition, children are going to get in the way of short-term and long-term plans. If someone plans on sleeping 8 hours every night, so children tend to get in the way of that. So I think we all understand that you are responsible for them and you don't really have a choice. The question is, what about other people? What about other relatives? Or other people that you've accepted in your life, and you've become someone who is helping such people, and now these people need you and they require you and lean on you. Are you required to help them, even if it's to your detriment?
These are all things that would depend on the individual circumstances,
So,
the individual relationships. How could you give a general answer?
Well, we can't deal with specific situations, but what we can do is try to discuss how to figure out some level of a balance between the people I'm responsible for. Every situation is going to be different, but what is the general outline of me? How much do I need to give up for the sake of others? So we'll see. We'll see from the examples in the parsha. We have 2 examples in this week's parsha that I'd like to discuss. The first one, I'll read to you the pasuk. Avraham Avinu comes back up from Mitzrayim, and it says, "V'gam lelot haholech es Avram," and Lot too, who was with Avram, he had all these sheep and cattle and tents, and the land was just not big enough to hold them all. And a quarrel broke out. The simple understanding of the verse is that they were struggling over space to be, but as Rashi explains to us, there was something a little deeper going on. The Lot, and we're assuming the shepherds got this message from their master, from Lot. The shepherds of Lot were taking a sort of free rein in the sense of where they would take their sheep. They would go wherever they like to go, with a sort of understanding that technically this land is theirs. While the shepherds of Avram were told, even though this land will eventually be ours, right now we are to act as complete strangers on the land. And so they got into a fight. The shepherds of Avraham were quarreling with the shepherds of Lot, saying that you guys are misbehaving. You're not doing what you're supposed to do.
Do the Meforshim definitely say that the shepherds got the clue from Lot?
It doesn't say so in the Rashi who quotes this, but the commentaries do say that, because it does seem that Avraham says to Lot, "Let there not be a quarrel between me and you, and between my shepherds and your shepherds." So it sounds like Avram understood that this was not just going to be an issue between the shepherds where he would say, listen, let your people resolve it with my people. But this was going to be an issue between Avram and Lot. And so what's Avram's suggestion? That they separate. That they split. This is Lot, who he has been taking care of, nurturing him for all these years. And it comes down to a dispute between uncle and nephew. And it almost doesn't seem like Avraham to say, you know what? Maybe it's better we don't dwell in each other's proximity anymore. Does that seem like the Avraham that we're discussing elsewhere in the parsha?
Well, if he felt that, and this is one of those arguments that neither side's going to convince the other, and he sees that Lot is steadfast and really truly believes that he's right, well, that's kind of that would be a conflict that would just create more and more tension between the two of them. So it would be better, and Lot's not a child anymore, he's a grown-up, right? He's got this, he doesn't need to rely on Abraham anymore. So you go do your thing, I'll do my thing. Did it necessarily mean they weren't going to see each other?
Well, he says, separate yourself from me. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. If it's just that this is somehow going to escalate, you have to remember, Avram Avinu is inviting all kinds of people into his tent. We know from next week's parsha that he tells them to wash their feet, and Rashi says because they were bringing the dust of the idol worship. He didn't want that in his tent. So he has no problem doing kiruv on these total idol worshippers, guys who, according to this one pshat, actually worship the dust of the earth. So them he brings into the house and he feeds them and he takes care of them. But his nephew has one area where maybe he is being sinful and wrong, and maybe they just don't talk about this issue. But for some reason Avram feels he has to cut him off.
It doesn't say they're cutting off or just
Distancing. This is serious separation. It doesn't seem like, you're just reading the verse, that a relationship which they've built over the last 20 years is now going to be, it is the severing of a very strong relationship.
So when do you sever a relationship with a relative? When they're harming you in other ways, or you've tried your best. My guess is Abraham has all this time been working on Lot just like he's worked on the other people that have been with him. And he's found that it's not working. I mean, he doesn't seem to be picking up any of the ideals such that Gezel doesn't seem to mean much to him. He's actually stealing, and we saw with Noah how bad Gezel was. So he's just not learning the lessons that Abraham's providing for him. And Abraham says, okay, it's time to separate. You just haven't learned what I've tried to teach you.
I hear you, absolutely. Would we have said the same thing if this was Avram's son? Would we also say, listen, I've tried. I did my best to give this over to Lot, and it's just not working, and we're assuming, and this is a little bit of an assumption, and therefore there's going to be some negative result from all this, which I think what Kathy was suggesting was that there would be a continued or an escalation of this fighting, so it's better to stop it where it is, but it is an act of cutting off on some level.
We did do that with Ishmael. I mean, it wasn't his initiation, it was Sarah initiated.
We'll get...
But you said, what if it had been his son? So he did do it with his son.
But he only did it because Hashem told him
Right.
to.
He did not want to do it. He fought his wife on that one.
I didn't think about escalation as the issue. I thought it was, when Avram is dealing with, later on, he's dealing with different kings and so on. And he says, I'm not even going to take a shoelace. I think his approach is that he wants people to do the right thing because it's the right thing for them to do. not because they're going to profit from it.
Right.
And I mean, I don't know a Perush that says this directly, but I've always read the Torah directly to mean that his problem with Lot was that Avram sees himself as being perhaps defined or characterized by what Lot is doing, and he can't stand that, and that's actually going to interfere with, that's actually going to ruin his total approach, the
Right.
souls that he
Right.
made in
Right.
Haran, and it's just going to ruin that, and
Right.
so he can't tolerate.
You know what this sounds like, though? I see where you're going, but this sounds like the concept of, yeah, it's not exactly like, but it's very similar to, and it's the same rationale as the concept of kicking a boy out of school who's going to end up with no school because he's having a negative influence on the other boys.
No,
And-
it's different. When you're talking about kicking kids out of school, you're talking about children. Lot was no longer a child, he was an adult.
Yes, but when we're talking about Abraham having the spiritual responsibility, he is the guide, and he's sacrificing the real, because Lot ends up from this, the rest of his life is downward. Really, the rest of his life, from being captured and then being part of Sodom and being, and then at the end, I mean, he's the joke of the world. In just a few years from now, with the incident with his daughters, this is going to lead Lot to a very bad place. He is going to end up, so to speak, in the gutter. And it's because, we would think, it's because Avram makes this choice to cut him off. But we're saying for the sake of, and that's the argument, for the sake of what Avram is trying to do, for the sake of the goals, he's trying to run this kiruv for monotheism, and you've got this one guy who is compromising all his attempts, and he's showing people a negative side, making a chilul Hashem, when people see that here is, but he is in the end making this choice to have Lot sent away.
But Lot was still old enough and
Even
mature
I don't know if it's a question
to
of
make
age.
good decisions or
Clearly
bad
not.
decisions of his own.
Clearly not. If Avram sends him away and Lot says, "This is my chance to go to Sodom," which we'll talk about soon. So clearly, and it's not a question of age. Avram is, in some sense, responsible for Lot. We may remember, certainly according to the Midrash, that Sarah and Lot and Milcah, all three are the children of Haran, the brother of Avram, who did die in the fiery furnace. And Avraham took a responsibility for Sarah and for Lot, while the other brother, Nachor, took Milcah. So in a sense, he is raising him, whether like a brother-in-law or as a son, but he is raising him. The shepherds seem to feel that Lot is the inheritor of Avraham. So there is some sense of that kind of relationship. And to say he's an adult, I think that in this case we clearly see that Lot was not safe on his own in spiritual terms. So in truth, let's take a look. I copied here the Medrash Rabbah in this parsha. This issue is a debate in the Medrash Rabbah. Just what I underlined, Vashem Amar al Avram. So some of the commentaries explain that the Vahashem is understood in Midrashic terms to be the based in of Hashem. That's what it says in the pasuk. Vahashem, meaning Hashem and the entourage, spoke to Avram.
Is it through every place that you said Hashem?
Yeah, that's what the Medrash tells us. Wherever it says Vahashem and Hashem, so it's referring to some kind of judgment or justice.
It's not just in Hashem, it's in the Hashem.
Right. Vahashem. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda says, Kas haya la'avinu Avraham b'shah sheperish Lot ben achiv me'ima. There was anger against Avraham when Lot went away from him. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, Lakol hu medabek, every person you bring close, ulalot achiv eina medabek, and to Lot your brother, or his brother, he can't do that. Now, it's not literally a brother, it's a brother-in-law, but in other words, you can do kiruv on everyone, And sometimes this is very true. Sometimes people find a way to be open and welcoming to strangers and to their own family and to children they have a hard time connecting to. Okay. That's the first opinion in the Medrash, that Avraham made a terrible mistake by sending away Lot. The second explanation, Rabbi Nechemia Amar, Kas hayel HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'shah shaya mahalich Lot im Avram. Hashem was angry the whole time that Lot was going with Avraham Avinu. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem says, Ani amarti lo, I clearly said to Avram, L'zaracha nasati es haaretz hazos, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. V'hu madbik es Lot ben achiv k'dei liyarsho, and he allowed Lot to tag along as if he was some kind of inheritor. It was Lot was living as someone who believed himself to be next in line, and Abraham never disillusioned him from this. Abraham never told him that this wasn't going to be the case, and so on some level that's part of what lead Lot to. And Abraham doesn't feel. Abraham figures when he has a son, Lot will pick it up on his own. So that means that in a certain sense, Abraham was, let's go back to your word, nurturing Lot as if he was his inheritor. Why doesn't he bring in two schleppers from the street and give it to them? As much as he wants his nephew. And therefore, Hashem was angry with Abraham and said, finally, you kicked that, let's use the word again, schlepper, out of the house. That's not you holding on to Lot. And you were only holding on to him because you were wanting like a plan B. That whole thing was an act of lack of faith of Avram for keeping him around. Clearly, we have in the Medrash two different opinions. One who says that Avram made a terrible mistake by sending away Lot, and the other opinion in the Medrash says, on the contrary, this was what Hashem had been waiting for Avram to do for years now.
How could these guys, they come up with two different opinions?
Welcome to the world of our sages.
They say it in the name of Hashem.
No, because all we know is that there was some anger. Va'Hashem means there was an attribute of judgment. So now that's all we know. So the question is, what was the attribute of judgment? Either Abraham did the wrong thing, or Abraham had been doing the wrong thing, and now finally he did the right thing. Rashi, on this verse, picks a side. Rashi says, and I quote, Hashem spoke to Avram, Achrei hipared Lot, after Lot separates from him, Kol zman sheharasha imo. As long as this wicked man was with him, Hayahadibur poresh mimenu, Hashem did not speak to Avraham. Avraham, maybe Avram knew, was sacrificing on some level his prophecy in order to keep Lot with him. That's a big statement, it seems, from Rashi. Especially now, Rashi just says Hashem didn't talk to him this whole time. But I think maybe Rashi doesn't mean this. You could read it that Avram didn't realize. But seemingly, Avram understands that by keeping Lot with him, he's making a choice to lose in his own spiritual accomplishment.
Did Abraham feel that he was a Rasha, or is Rashi saying he's a Rasha?
Well, that's what I'm sort of...
20/20 vision.
Well, that's what it's... You see, it's hard to think that Avram didn't know why Hashem isn't speaking to him. It's hard to imagine that. Avram must have known why Hashem is not speaking to him, and it's because Lot is with him. So that means Avram understood that there's already some Russia aspect there, but he was somehow ignoring it until he sends him away, at least that's the way Rashi reads, and Hashem finally speaks to Avram and says, okay, now here's the prophecy.
When Hashem said, Lech, wasn't Lot with him at that time?
Yes. So there's some questions, some ambiguity in the commentaries, whether he was meant to take Lot with him. That's all part of this debate that we're having here, is how you're going to read those verses as well. Because it says, Mi beis avicha, from your, get away from your family.
But Hashem was talking to him and Lot was with him at the time.
Well, I know what with him means. If he's in his home and he's got all his relatives around, and Hashem says, get away from your family.
But they had already moved. They moved from their family.
Right, but wherever they are,
Now they're in.
right, but wherever they are, he's telling him to separate from his family. So was he at that time supposed to say to Lot, you know what, you go one direction, I go the other?
The question is, where is Sarah all this time?
She doesn't get involved in this one. We'll get soon to the whole Hagar story. That's where she's involved. Seemingly, she's staying out of this one.
So maybe that's another reason why Hashem might have been angry, because he commanded Abraham to go away from his father's house, and he takes his father's house with him.
Or at least one member. Yes, that's those commentaries who read that Lot was a bad guy the whole time, we're going to clarify that in a minute, would read that Abraham had made a mistake originally by taking him.
Right, but Lot doesn't even need to be a bad guy for that.
Right,
Because
well,
Hashem told you to do something and you didn't.
except,
do it.
I get it, this is away from where I wanted to go, but if you read the previous Parsha, you'll see that the way it's read is more that, actually at the beginning of this week's Parsha, where it says, Avram begins to travel, Vayelech ito Lot. It doesn't say they took with him Lot, but Vayelech ito Lot, and Lot tagged along. So that means that Avram never invited Lot.
Oh, okay.
Right. At least that's the simple reading of the verse.
So what, isn't Lot, Abraham by this age is like 70 some odd.
75 years old, yeah.
So Lot already figured out, if he did not have a child by now, the chance of having a child is very
Yeah. It was amongst the shepherds, they understood it was a given that Lot was next in line.
Now, Abram is a very unique person in that, Hashem spoke to him when he was in Haran, and, is there any aspect of the uniqueness of Abraham that would impact on our interpreting and applying what he did to our situation today?
Well, we certainly would have to take into account the differences between ourselves and Avraham. However, but if the Torah is written for us, we're certainly supposed to try to absorb these lessons and try to use them to make our decisions as well. We just have to make sure we understand things properly, and that we don't try to read into it what we would like to read into it.
Right.
Yeah, because many of us would like to say, we see from here, if someone's getting in your way, send them to Sodom. Right? That's
And then Hashem will keep you.
right. So Rashi continues, and actually the next part of the Rashi is in parentheses. So, and this is what Rashi says. Rashi asks a question. What are we talking about? Do we just say that Hashem did not speak to Avram as long as Lot was with him? Earlier in the Parsha, it says that Hashem appeared to him and spoke to him and said, Vayera Hashem al Avram, and he said, I will give your descendants this land. As a matter of fact, that's what we said, and the Medrash said, was the problem with him bringing Lot with him, was that Hashem had appeared to him while he was traveling with Lot. So Rashi says, no. That's because at that time, Lot was a good guy. When Lot tags along, when Avraham is 75 years old and they first come to Eretz Yisrael, when Lot tags along, at that point, Lot is a good guy, and Avraham tolerates him. Something happened between that time and this time which turned Lot from being, and I use the words of Rashi, from being kasher to being a rasha. So the Sifsei Chachamim, one of the super commentaries on Rashi, quotes the explanation that what happened was Lot went down to Egypt with Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham and Sarai were righteous and were not influenced by the Egyptian culture. But Lot went down there and he saw a land filled with immorality. And that changed Lot. That's what the Sifsei Chachamim says. Lot went down to Egypt and that changed them. And when they came back up, Avram could already tell that Lot was a different person. We're told when Avram sends Lot away, it says, Vayisa Lot es Einov. Lot lifts up his eyes. whenever you see the term lifts up his eyes, our sages understood that's a euphemism for following immorality or following after the sins of the eyes. The reason why Lot chooses Sodom is not like it's described in the Torah as it was a land that was fruitful and everything was growing and it was green and everything was beautiful over there. Rather, he was following after his eyes because he wanted the freedom of action that was provided in Sodom. So the Sifsei Chachamim says that happens to Lot when they go down to Egypt. So, according to this, Lot, it was okay for Lot to be with Avram this whole time. Hashem previously spoke to him. But when Lot comes back up, and now he's got all these desires and things that he's doing, and he's acting out on them. Now, I know we're talking about Lot committing theft, but it was a result of his desire and following his wants and needs and not following the ways that Avram had taught him. At that point, at least according to this opinion of Rashi, Hashem no longer speaks to Avram. Hashem separates himself from Avram because Avram is connecting to Lot. And only when Avram separates himself from Lot and allows Lot to go where he really wants to go, which is to indulge in the freedoms of Sodom, when Avram sends away Lot, at that point, Hashem speaks to Avram. That's the approach that Rashi chooses, of the two approaches in the Midrash. Rashi goes according to the Tanchuma, but the idea, it's still a choice between the two explanations. Rashi understood that it's the explanation that Avram was supposed to send away Lot. That's one half of our discussion. If I may, I want to move further down into the parsha.
So they're saying Abraham was following the tough
Where when he sends him away.
There's this, if a child is, an older child is creating too much havoc in a family, there's something called the tough love approach, where you tell them you can't be here anymore until you decide to shape up. It's a shape up or ship out type thing.
Right.
Right.
But he doesn't even say he doesn't even give him the option of shaping up. I mean, maybe that came earlier, but at this point, he's already saying, you just go this way, and I'll go that way. And it's interesting because there's a Onkelos generally translates things as literally as possible. Not very often does he make a change in the words. But here, when Avram tells Lot, if you go right, I go left. If you go left, I go right, Onkelos translates it as, if you imat letzipuna, ana ledaroma. V'imat ledaroma, ana letzipuna. If you go south, I'll go north. If you go north, I go south. That's not a good translation. Right and left is not the same as north and south. So the way the commentaries explain is that even though he told him, if you go right, I go left, which means if you go one direction, I'll go the other direction. But what he was really saying to him is that you should only go one of two directions, either north or south, but not east, which is where Sodom is. As it says, and is the basically Sodom is the eastern border of Vayisa Lot Mikedem. He traveled Mikedem from Mizrach Tamar in the east-west direction. And Avram was saying to him, the uncle says, as if Avram was telling him, Sodom shouldn't be an option for you. And of course, that's the place he goes. Okay. Moving forward in the parsha, we have another situation where we have a confrontation, this time not between Avram and Lot, but this time between Sarai and Hagar. The way the Torah describes it, Sarai, the wife of Avram, did not have children, but she did have an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. Now, who is this Egyptian maidservant? So our sages tell us that this was the daughter of Pharaoh, the princess of Egypt, who, when Avram left the house of Pharaoh, he said, my daughter would be better off being a maidservant in the house of Avram than being a princess in Egypt. And so he sent her along with Sarai to be her maidservant. Sarai says to Avram, Hashem has withheld me from having children. take my maidservant, perhaps we will have a child through her. And so it is, she becomes pregnant. When she becomes pregnant, Vatekal Gevirta Be'enaha. Her mistress, her person in charge of her, became, what's a good word? Lowly, or lesser in her eyes. She began to see herself as the woman of the house, the one bearing the heir to Avraham's. It's interesting. It's almost the same thing, right? You've got Lot thinking that he's the heir, and here you've got this woman, Hagar, who also doesn't deserve any, but is claiming to be the main wife or the woman of the house because she's holding or carrying the heir to Avraham's kingdom. And Sarai goes complaining to Avram. She says, Chamasi alecha, my problem is with you. I did you a favor and I gave you and now I've got all these issues. Hashem should judge between us. To which Avram says, she's your maidservant. Do whatever you want. Avram does not disagree with her. He basically says to Sarai, you can do whatever you wish to do. Vata'aneha Sarai. And Sarai afflicted her, caused her pain. We'll talk about the nature of that in a minute. But Sarai did something to cause pain to this woman, to Hagar. But tivrach mipaneha, and so Hagar flees. Rashi explains, Vataneh Sarai, Haisemeshabedes babakoshi, she worked her in a much more difficult way. Here she is, a pregnant woman, and instead of having an easier time, she is now being made to work harder. Now, if you thought the other situation didn't sound like Abraham, this certainly doesn't sound like Sarah. It doesn't sound like the one who's hosting people from all over the world and making her home open. And here, this pregnant woman who is rightfully being disrespectful and inappropriate, but because of that, she's making her work harder.
The whole thing seems very, very wrong. First of all, Abraham obviously had an intimate relationship with this woman at least one time.
Right.
And then to just
Well,
cast her away, do whatever you want with her, seems to me very,
Well,
that's
you,
also very
you can't it's not do whatever you want. In this situation, you handle it the way you'd like to handle it. She's your maidservant. This is your charge, your responsibility. Make a decision as to what you want to do. So Sarah made a decision. Her decision was that we are going to work this woman harder. And basically, we'll talk about this, but basically, according to Rashi, what she's trying to do is teach her a lesson. Put her in her place.
she's a princess, right?
But she's been a maidservant for a while now. She's been doing she was okay, she understood her role. But as soon as she becomes pregnant, that changes. Right? So and the angel comes to Hagar and says to Hagar, how are you doing? Hagar, Shifchas Sarai. How are you doing, Hagar, the maidservant of Sarai? Where are you coming from? In other words, not how are you doing, Hagar, but how are you doing, slave woman? And she says, Mipnai Sarai gevirti anochi barachas, I'm fleeing from my master, my mistress, from Sarai. So, according to the commentaries, her response is that as soon as the angel refers to her, she sort of realizes that that's where all these issues lay. Is that even if she became pregnant, Sarah would have shown her respect and all those other things and given her the ease that she needed and the comforts. She was carrying their child, but not when she tried to turn it into and take the place of Sarai. And so the angel says to her, really? Okay. Shuvi el gevirtech, go back home. Return to Sarah. V'his'ani tachas yada, and allow yourself to be oppressed beneath her hand. And you know what? It'll be worth it for you. Harba arba ezarech, I will give you many descendants. V'lo yisafer merov, there will be so many you won't be able to count.
You can tell me that it really happened.
Right? You ready for this? Says the Ramban. And if there was ever a more fitting thought to the difficulties we face today, "Vataneha Sarai vativrach mipanea chata imenu be'inui hazeh." Our mother sinned with this oppression. The Ramban. V'gam Avraham, and Avram sinned too. Behenicha olasas came by letting her do this. V'shama Hashem el Anya, and Hashem heard her pain. V'nasan laben, and gives her a son. She yehe pera adam, who will be a wild man. Lano zera Avram v'Sara, constantly oppressing and giving pain to the descendants of Avram and Sarah. B'chol mina inu, with all kinds of oppressions. The Ramban understood that all the troubles that we've faced for the last few thousand years under the hands of Yishmael was a result of the mistake by Avram and Sarah in inappropriately treating Hagar in this situation. That's a scary thought. It's a scary thought to try to, all the difficulties we're facing today. Today we're living in a world where many of our brethren are not sure when they're walking down the street, they're looking in all directions because people are just behaving in a completely uncivilized way. A wild man. The Ramban says he gave her a son, she a para Adam, that Yishmael will be a para Adam, a wild man, because he was born as a bracha to her, as a sort of a vengeance that she will get for the oppression which she faced from our mother and father, Avraham and Sarah.
So does he have any suggestions on how to rectify that problem?
That's all the Ramban says.
It's too late, it's something too late.
Right. Well, I mean,
We can't rectify what's...
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
well,
Put an Iranian Jew in charge of Israel, and the problem goes away.
Well, that's not rectifying the problem. You're just making the problem go away. There's a difference between making the punishment, which is a result of your mistake, go away, or actually correcting the mistake. I don't know. Is there something which we can do for the world of Yishmael to rectify the pain that their mother had? I don't know.
I mean, killing 4 to 10 million Sephardi Jew or Iranian Jew isn't enough?
One of the commentaries says on this Ramban, he says almost those words. He says, thousands of years, thousands of Jews. At what point did we fulfill repair that? To this Ramban, the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Rosh Hashiva of Volozhin, says absolutely not. He says the Ramban is going against what our sages teach us. We find that our sages lavish nothing but praise on every decision that Sarah makes. When she was 100, she was like she was 20. At 20, she was like she was 7. Our sages, we don't find any fault being attributed to Sarah in any of these things. And therefore, for the Ramban, excuse the words, to pull this out of nowhere, the Ramban was not supposed to do this. This is not the correct pshat. And this is what the Netziv says. I'll read it inside and I quote. Shelo mitzad kinas hakavod ukedoma. Our mother Sarah did not do this because she was upset of being dishonored. Elohaya nogea lavodas Hashem. This was affecting the service of Hashem. Basher Havina Sarah understood Shebamesha Hekila Hagar Bikvoda, when Hagar began to disrespect Sarah. When Hagar clearly knew the greatness of Sarah. Because Hagar knew what Hashem had done to her father when he had tried to touch Sarah. That's part of why Hagar becomes the shivcha to Sarah, because her father says, this woman is the most special woman in the world. She is a prophetess. She is the woman of God. If you get a chance to be her maidservant, her father had said to her, you're better off being a maidservant to this woman than you are being a princess. And she took this seriously. And she went with Sarah. Elishikila beliba b'chvod shemayim, and so the disrespect Hagar was showing Sarah was really a disrespect towards heaven. She was disregarding the prophecies of Sarah. She was disregarding the unique place that Sarah had in the eyes of Hashem. And for that, one may become angry. As he quotes the Gemara, Haitzuber merabanan derasach, if you see a Torah sage become angry, Oraisa derasach be, it's the Torah's anger, not his own. Now, even though the Gemara tells us there that the Torah sage is still supposed to avoid that, ein zeh chet, but it's not a sin. You cannot call this a sin, and certainly you cannot attribute to this mistake that Sarah made all the future evils that the Jewish people would suffer by the hands of Yishmael. In quotes, these are the words: "The kach teva eish Torah, such is the nature of the fire of Torah. The kach hayakinas eish yiras Hashem atzura b'lvava. This was the jealousy for the sake of Hashem that Sarah experienced. Ad shelo shamra machmazel. Listen to these words carefully. Halichus derech eretz karoi liisha kavuda laleches in shivchasa benachas v'ma'at kibeda. To the point where Sarah made a judgment to allow her anger for the sake of Hashem to push aside the proper, can I use the word etiquette? Not etiquette, but the appropriate moral approach for a modest woman to take, that to always treat her maidservant with gentleness and with very little strictness. In other words, Sarah always treated her with gentleness and with care. And she sacrificed that gentleness and care and was on some level harsh with her, which only, says the Netziv, relative to the way that she usually treated her so well, was this a stepping out of bounds. Nowhere near having done anything which would be a sin. For example, if Sarah would have done something, say, to endanger the mother or the child, that, okay, now you're talking about serious stuff. And Tziv says she never did that. All she did was treat her maybe like normal people would treat. She didn't keep the usual care and gentleness that she did reserve for her maidservants, even when they failed. You know, like you have all these stories about the person who, someone made a mistake in the house. You have all these stories of the righteous people when someone made a mistake in their house and they covered it up and made it look like they were the ones that did it. The famous story of Rabbi Petterberger, who his wife had. His wife was ill, so she was laying in bed, and there was a woman who was helping around the house, and she called out while the family was dining at the table. The woman called from bed, and she called out to the maidservant, asking her if she had served all the food that she had prepared to be served for her family. And the woman said, yes, she had. While Rabbi Petterberger was sitting at the table without that food. And this woman was standing right next to him and calling back that she had served the food that the wife had prepared. So Rabbi Petterberger did not say a word. He continued to eat his dinner, and this woman, who obviously had taken this food home to her own home and eaten it herself or to whoever she was feeding, continued to do what she was doing. And they say that the greatness of Reb Itzel Petterberger was not that he didn't say anything to his wife and say, "What are you talking about? I don't have any of the chicken soup," that she was asking, and then embarrassing the woman. That's not what was so great about him. What was so great about him was that he was so nice to the people who worked at his house, that this woman who worked at the house was not worried to call back, "Yes, I gave it to your husband," even though she was standing right next to her husband and he could hear her lying, because she trusted that he would never embarrass another person. We're talking about someone who only lived 100 years ago, who, even though he was being lied to in his face, everyone knew he wasn't going to embarrass someone else. Sarah, certainly, the great prophetess. You do not become a prophetess by having anger issues. She was someone who was typically gentle and caring. But here, in this case, says the Netziv, for the sake of the honor of Hashem, she stepped out of the normal boundaries that she made for herself.
How did this help the honor of Hashem?
Well, no, she was telling her off. She was telling her off, and she was causing her more difficulty than usual.
Well, how would that help?
Well, she was trying to teach her a lesson. Clearly it didn't work because the woman decided to not accept the lesson and run away. So one of the Bali Musar writes, he says, put this here. We know the Torah tells us, Kol almana v'yasom lo sa'anam. You're not allowed to cause pain to people who are themselves afflicted. To a widow, to an orphan, there is a certain Rosh Hashiva in Eretz Yisrael who, when someone comes to apply for a place in his yeshiva, and he one of the questions you ask is, where do you live and what do your parents do? If the response that this young man who's applying for the yeshiva gives is that either of his parents is no longer in the world, he stops the interview and accepts the student into his yeshiva. Because he won't be able to say no to an orphan. That's because the Torah says you cannot afflict, you cannot cause pain to a widow or an orphan. So he quotes, the Das Torah quotes, he says that Rabbi Shmuel said to Rabbi Shimon, when he said, why am I being killed? This was during the story of the 10 martyrs. He said, what have I done to deserve this? So he asked him, did you ever delay a judgment so that you could take care of something personal? And he says, yeah, we do that all the time. He says, well, that's why you're suffering like this. Rabbi Yerucham writes, he says, I see that certain people who are responsible for other people, specifically rabbis and community leaders, who have something called, this is a relatively new invention, a waiting room. They have a waiting room where people sit and wait for you to finish your personal things, and then you will take them. That qualifies as causing pain, certainly if it's an orphan or a widow, causing them pain on that level. Anyway, Rabbi Yerucham says, I don't think that when Sarah did something painful to Hagar, that it was something that was actually pain. But this was something which, relatively speaking, on her level, would have been some level of oppression. That would have been some level of difficulty that she was applying to Hagar, at least something that Hagar considered pain. So it's interesting that this Hagar who we're discussing now actually also comes out of Egypt. She comes out of Egypt having completely changed from the story of Abraham and Sarah. While Lot, who was an Adam Kasher, before he went down to Egypt, goes down to Egypt and comes out with problems as a Russia. We're using the word Russia. You have another person, this Hagar, who was in Egypt as a regular Egyptian and is now the maidservant of Sarai, is now the help and support for the world's prophetess. That's the completely opposite direction. And yet, she has a similar issue to Lot. She somehow feels that she's the one who's inheriting, or she has the place as in this role. And the same way that Avram has to make a choice as to what to do with Lot, Sarah has to make a choice as to what to do with Hagar. And Avram, as we said, avoids this issue completely. He says to Sarah, this is your choice. You decide what should be done. And Sarah makes the choice to punish whatever level, whether you consider it to be a real punishment, where she really worked her hard, or as we're saying, according to Netziv, she just went out of the regular boundaries, or according to Rabbi Yerucham, basically gave even the slightest amount of pain to this woman, and that would be considered pain. But she made the choice to afflict her and try to chastise her or punish her and change her. And in both cases, we have a debate. In the case of Lot, we have a machlokus in the Midrash as to whether Avraham made the right decision or not. And again, we have a machlokus here between the commentaries as to whether Sarah did the right thing or not. According to, someone was asking before how we have extreme opinions. You think about extreme opinions in the case of Lot, where one says it was the right thing to do, one says it was a terrible thing to do. And look at the case of Sarah. In one case, it was nothing. It was the slightest change in the way she was being treated, which only because Hagar was overreacting even becomes an issue. While the other opinion says that, the Ramban says that this was so bad that thousands of years later we're suffering today as a result of this misdeed. So when I started with the beginning of the class with this ethical dilemma, and we said, what do you do when you've got people in your lives who you have to make a choice about telling them off or sending them away? And we didn't even get into the whole sending away the next time of Hagar and Ishmael. We're just dealing with what was done here. Sarai does not send Hagar away, but she keeps her and tries to change her. Hagar runs away.
Does she run away out of fear or out of embarrassment?
It seems like she's trying to run away from the pain. Because when the angel says to her, "Where are you running from?" she says, "I'm running from my master, from my mistress, Sarah." So she's basically she doesn't want to accept the lesson that's being taught to her. At least that's the way some commentaries read it. So someone said, I think you said, that, well, you can't really make a rule about whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, because every situation is differently. And that's exactly the answer. Based on how you analyze this specific situation, because the Torah only gives us the outline, based on how you understand all the different understandings of the situation. In other words, if you take the approach that, let's say, Lot was already became up from Egypt corrupt, so now we can take that as a lesson and say that if, let's say, there is someone who maybe was a good person, but then they got involved with some bad friends, and as a result of that, they're dragging everyone else down, then we could take that as a lesson and say, well, there is a point at which you say to someone, maybe you should get your own apartment and live out of the house. On the other hand, if we are to take the other approach, that this was just becoming too much for Avraham, and he wanted to focus, like the other opinion of the Medrash, that he wanted to focus on more people, and this was becoming a whole track of tasks to do, which was dealing with the Lot situation. In that case, we would learn from this Medrash, or this opinion in the Medrash, that this is our lesson, that you cannot send someone away and cut someone off just because they're becoming too much of a burden in your life. Now, how do we measure that? If someone does take up 3, 4, 6, 10 hours of someone's day, clearly at some point you can reclaim your life. That's something which you have to leave open. And in the case of Hagar, where she was disrespecting, it's a little different in the case of Hagar, because it doesn't sound like she was bringing anyone else down, but she certainly was not taking her place, and she was, according to the Netziv, she was causing, it was a little bit of a Chilul Hashem, she was disrespecting Sarah's role as the great prophetess, but according to the other commentaries, she was simply dishonoring or showing disrespect to someone who she's supposed to respect. And it is Sarah's responsibility to teach her and to guide her. And the question is, how much should she have done? And if she crossed the line, then we are suffering terrible consequences because of it. If she didn't cross the line, then she was overreacting and the angel sends her back. This is something which, even if we don't know, even if we can't take our situations and compare them exactly to these situations, but clearly we see that these issues are addressed in the Torah. And we have to try to derive the lesson, certainly push ourselves. I say most of us probably err in the wrong direction, probably more towards trying to get people away. Some people behave differently. Some people just take everyone and accept everyone, and they've got to also send themselves more into a balanced situation. But for most people, we have to try to figure out when there are people who are difficult or people who are maybe bringing harm to our situation or to others, we have to be very careful with the way that we balance it. And just to use as an example, the Chazon Ish paskin, that even if a student is in the yeshiva and he's bringing other students down, you still cannot send them away from the yeshiva. And that was a very big psak on the part of the Chazon Ish, which I know many schools who don't follow this Chazon Ish because they wouldn't know how to handle themselves if they did. So at least in our lives, when we shouldn't face such dilemmas. But if we do, we should try to take the lessons of our forefathers, and hopefully we'll make the right decision. Thank you.